evening, everyone. And thank you for those of you who are present for braving the weather. Although it cleared a bit this afternoon, we know that when the evening comes and the sun goes down and temperatures begin to change, that changes the way we move about in the world. So thank you for being here and for enjoying a meal together. And for those who have logged in online, we also are grateful for your presence, that you have chosen to be here with us at this time for this very important conversation. Tonight, we continue our series of We Advocate Freedom, a teach-in series that has emerged out of concerns, out of passions, out of a desire to make a change in the world. And so we've already gone through the first 4 sessions of the series. Each series or each session was focused on something in particular that would help us to build our knowledge, to give us a greater foundation for engaging in advocacy, for meeting the challenges that are present in the world. And in this particular series, it was motivated by the desire to make a change as it relates to the crisis, to the war, to the loss of life, to the challenges of what it means to be alive and human as we're looking at Israel, Palestine, and what has taken place and continues to take place in Gaza. So our first session was really focused on how do we really think about, how ought we to think about advocacy and the significance of really engaging in personal and institutional activities for social change, where we had folks who were community organizers, labor organizers, who talked about the importance of these different groups coming together in order to bring about effective change. Session 2 was about how do we really engage these questions, given how complicated and complex these issues are. And it's not enough just to talk about history, because there's been a sense in which, well, if you just understand the history, you won't really have a problem. But we were really engaging with these challenges in light of the history and in light of the fact we're talking about lives. How people are really struggling to live together, and in some instances, how they're really not struggling to live together. And so we brought together voices from the Abrahamic tradition, from Islam, from Judaism, from Christianity, to talk about protest, ceasefire, and what we identified as the 2 states solution, which on that evening we were presented with, let's not talk about 2 states, let's talk about a 1-state solution. Thank you. The third, we looked at community chaplaincy and religious leadership, and to talk about what does it mean to be a spiritual leader in the context of struggle, in the context of a war-torn location. Because of these questions around should we in fact divest, we brought in persons from the United Methodist Church to talk about social principles of the United Methodist Church and what it means to be engaged in socially socially responsible investments and went through a kind of investments 101 so that we can have greater insight into what it means to raise these challenges and to engage in these activities that have to do with economics and the way economics inform and direct our activities. Sessions 5 and Session 6. Because of the activities that have taken place in and around Denver, we moved to a different format for Sessions 5 and Session 6. And so tonight, the focus of the conversation is as we're seeking to understand and assess the dynamics between advocacy, allyship, and resistance. The We Advocate Freedom Teach-In series will explore several grassroots issues in the United States related to Israel and Palestine and the protests that have taken place. You may recall that when the encampments were taking place around Denver, we had a surprise visitor to Denver. Dr. Angela Davis came and spoke at one of the encampments. And it was from that moment that I thought it would be important for us to take what she has had to say about freedom, grabbing her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, to be an important part of our conversation that helps us to, again, engage in what it means to be a social justice advocate. So our point of departure for conversation tonight is her book. I shared with you when the series began that I really tried to get her to be our speaker. Unfortunately, we couldn't manage that. But tonight we are gathered to have a conversation that springboards from this book with an important person. And I want you to know how very blessed, how very fortunate we are to have with us on this evening, Dr. Rami Nashashibi. I have not kept it a secret that many of the persons that have been invited to be a part of our conversations are actually colleagues of mine and folks that I worked with in Chicago. Tonight is no exception. You will read Dr. Nashashibi's bio in what has been printed online, but you also need to know that he and I were faculty colleagues together at Chicago Theological Seminary. That's where we met. That's where we partnered. That's where we worked together to really address the issues that were facing theological education as it was being developed in Chicago. But Chicago also had a center that began as the Jewish, Christian, Muslim center where it was a commitment to work interreligiously. That center then transitioned into an interreligious dialogue center for which Dr. Nashashibi came in and was teaching courses on Islam. And he also was really deeply committed and engaged in grassroots work that was listening to the voices of the underrepresented through hip hop, and helping us at Chicago to really engage in the community at the level of grassroots. And so he has been working as a grassroots organizer for decades. And so bringing him here is also helping us to know the importance of grassroots organizing, and a grassroots organizing that does not compartmentalize. So he has been committed to working both interreligiously and interculturally in order to bring about change that is representing where folks live and where their lives need to be affected. But I also want to introduce him tonight in a slightly different way because he caught the attention of President Barack Obama. And so,
second story, just yesterday, some of you may be aware I visited a mosque in Baltimore to let our Muslim American brothers and sisters know that they too are Americans and welcome here. And there I met a Muslim American named Rami Nashashibi, who runs a nonprofit working for social change in Chicago. And he forms coalitions with churches and Latino groups and African Americans and this poor neighborhood in Chicago. And he told me about how the day after the tragedy in San Bernardino happened, he took his 3 young children to a playground in the Marquette Park neighborhood. And while they were out, the time came for one of the 5 daily prayers that are essential to the Muslim tradition. And on any other day, he told me, he would have immediately put his rug out on the grass right there and prayed. But that day he paused. He feared any unwelcome attention he might attract to himself and his children. And his 7-year-old daughter asked him, "What are you doing, Dad? Isn't it time to pray?" And he thought of all the times he had told her the story of the day that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Robert Marks and 700 other people marched to that very same park, enduring hatred and bigotry, dodging rocks and bottles and hateful words in order to challenge Chicago housing segregation and to ask America to live up to our highest ideals. And so at that moment, drawing from the courage of men of different religions, of a different time, Rami refused to teach his children to be afraid. Instead, he taught them to be a part of that legacy of faith and good conscience. I want them to understand that sometimes faith will be tested, he told me, and that we will be asked to show immense courage, like others have before us, to make our city, our country, and a world a better reflection of all our ideals. And he put down his rug and he prayed.
And so with that introduction, we invite Dr. Rami Nashashibi to the stage to engage in conversation first with me and then with the rest of you, both in this room and online. Rami. Did I turn it off by accident? Okay. So Rami, welcome to Denver, and especially welcome to the Iliff School of Theology, and to this series that we've been hosting to engage in conversation on the meaning of freedom in this particular time. And so I want to begin our conversation in the ways that I've spoken with other guests, to ask folks to locate themselves as to how they and where they enter into this conversation. And I've heard, because we were colleagues at Chicago, I've heard some of your story, and I think it will be particularly valuable for our community to know where you've come from, how you've traveled to be this remarkable community organizer in Chicago that catches the eye of the president. But you were already, even before he spoke of you, quite active, and your faith always impressed me is the wrong word, but I always just felt close to you because of your faith stance, because of how you would take your scholarship and you would bring in the words of the prophet, and then you go back to the scholarship and you go back to the words of the prophet, and just to express not only who you are, but how we should understand the world and engage in relationship with one another. So for the sake of this community, say a word about who you
All
are.
right. Well, first, thank you. I feel profoundly grateful, honored to be here. As I was, and it's such a beautiful treat to be back in conversation with you. And as I was walking in, I was on the phone with our dear beloved brother, Dr. Reverend Otis Moss III, who reminded me of his connection to this institution and the legacy of Vincent Harding. And so I feel profoundly grateful to be in a space associated with that extraordinary genealogy of phenomenal theologians and organizers that have contributed so much to the world, and certainly to people like me who have been beneficiaries of that kind of struggle, which says something about my journey. I'm the proud grandson of Palestinian refugees to the south side of Chicago. In fact, some of the first Palestinians to enter into the South Side. This has been an extraordinary journey, just the last 4 days, for I'm sure all of us. For me, it started on Monday, burying my 98-year-old grandfather, who I was his eldest grandson. His name was Daoud Muhammad Ibrahim Daoud. He comes from a Jerusalem village called Ein Karam, the birthplace of John the Baptist, that sits right underneath land. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, and if you've ever happened to visit Yad Vashem, the memorial, the state memorial to the Holocaust, that literally sits underneath that memorial. That's his village. His house is still there. He was dispossessed and driven from that in May of 1948. As with his 9-month pregnant wife, my grandmother, who transitioned a few years ago, um, and who was pregnant with my mother at the time. In fact, they stopped outside a abandoned village. If you know, this is literally, she was a child, my mother, of the Nakba, of what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophic conditions that led to the formation of the State of Israel and the dispossession of over 700,000 Palestinians and the destruction or annexation of 500 villages. And my mother literally had a very biblical birth outside Bethlehem, while in flight. And they became refugees and settled on the south side of Chicago. Now, she married at some point. She grew up in the thick of all of the things that I often talk about, including being a high school student in Inglewood and Marquette Park, being among the few non-white families at that point when King marched into Marquette Park, that legacy that Obama is referencing. And then married my father. She met my father, who was coming from a very long 1800, like a family that's been in Jerusalem for over 800 years, on one trip. And they had me overseas. I was born in Jordan, and then they moved around a lot. It was the marriage didn't last that long. They divorced around 10 when I was 10, and but we had jumped around the world a lot. My father eventually, who also passed away around 15 years ago now, maybe longer, has they were we were living across the world, and I grew up. By the time I was 18, I think I had moved to maybe 8 different times, 12 different cities, as many different schools, um, and finally made my way back to Chicago, uh, and back to the South Side, where I did college there for a year. Then I ended up at DePaul and back to the University of Chicago, where I got my PhD in sociology. But throughout this entire moment, especially upon coming back to the South Side, one thing that I think most Palestinians growing up with, um, as disconnected as in some very real ways I was to a established community, I was always very hyper aware of being connected to the legacy of being Palestinian. And that's kind of forced upon you in very real ways. For me, it was visiting my grandmother in Jerusalem as a 9-year-old and strip searched at an Israeli checkpoint as we were going in, confronting for the first time that I remember the realities of military occupation as a young person. You don't forget that. You don't forget military soldiers, checkpoints, tanks. I don't think I'd ever seen that. And I'll never forget how absolutely adjusted my younger cousins and family were to that reality, and how absolutely petrified I was of it, and what it, I grew up shaped by that, remember that memory. But by the time I came to Chicago, I was eager. I was politicized already. It was the Gulf War. But I really wasn't brought up with a faith tradition, believe it or not. My father wasn't as practicing of any religion, although he certainly was Muslim. And because because of the divorce and remarrying, they just didn't have it. My mom wasn't brought up with the tradition. And so I never had any expectations of faith put upon me. And it was actually coming to the South Side, eventually, both through, I think, organizing movements, exploring the movements that eventually became absolutely imperative for me to understand, Black liberation movements. It was some of those first mentors that kind of took me under their wing that helped me connect the dots that are so illuminated in this extraordinary text by Angela Davis, and are her speeches that are recorded in this text. But the Angela Davises of the world, the the dots between Black liberation movements and and Palestinian struggle and Nicaraguan and El Salvadorian community, that became very real for me. While at the same time, I was very much inspired by cultural movements at the time. I was a hip hop generation kid. And so, Public Enemy came of age with Public Enemy, came of age with the consciousness that hip hop was infusing all of us with. And there was an undeniable also spiritual element within hip hop. And anyone that was attuned to kind of that era of hip hop, and it's, I would argue, still very present today, there was a spiritual consciousness that was very much interwoven with Muslim sensibilities that I found also, again, very attractive. I also started finding and discovering in the Black liberation struggle many of my favorite icons within the Black liberation struggle taking on Muslim identities, whether it was, people like Imam Jamil Al-Amin, H. Rap Brown, or others that began to find in Islam a Muslim sensibility that was very much parlayed with liberation movements that I had not ever thought about as a kid. And then finally, I think it was the deep spirituality, right? That also animated by the mystics and Sufi traditions that I also began to find as a creative, as a person that was very also interested in creative literature and reading a lot. That kind of drove me to all of those things that eventually culminated in a PhD that was looking at the history of Black street organizations on the South Side alongside hip hop movements to understand the post-industrial ghetto. I was doing that while organizing and building an organization called the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And then, eventually I was moonlighting as a professor here and there at places like the Chicago Theological Seminary that allowed us to interface with one another.
Thank you so much. It's just a powerful story. And I think what you have just shared with us is how important it is to look at a whole life and to engage in the world in which we live that helps us to know who we are, because you identified all these different moments that not only affected you, but influenced you to become the person you are. And that's always so important. So I've already identified that Dr. Angela Davis came to Denver and spoke at one of the encampments.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that suggested to me this book would be a good conversation piece for us, because she chose, not by invitation, but she chose to be here. And the title of the book says that we need to see how our stories are common stories. And from this perspective of them being common, our freedom is bound together. That this idea that I can't be free unless I am working for your freedom, and vice versa, that we really have to be engaged with one another. But even as we're talking about Angela Davis, there is often this assumption about who she is. And when you begin to even look online to explore this question of who is Angela Davis, and it's not advancing for me. So if you hit the next slide, please. And so there's always this question of who is Angela Davis? And in answering the question, folks tend to overlook important parts of her life. They especially tend to overlook the fact that we are talking about a profound intellectual who has been educated around the world in places that most of us don't imagine that a person who has her reputation of being such a radical would be present. And so there is this overlooking of the fact that she was born and grew up in Birmingham, Alabama during the civil rights struggle, during the time when Birmingham was often identified as Bombingham. We overlooked the fact that she traveled to Germany and studied for a few years, University of Frankfurt, and then went to the University of Paris. Now, remember, we're talking about this woman who tends to only be seen as her afro and tends to only be understood as this radical militant with an afro, and overlooks the fact that she graduated with her undergraduate degree from Brandeis University, which is what kind of university? A Jewish university, who then goes on to study at the University of California, where she earned her MA before going back to Germany to Humboldt University of Berlin, where she earned her PhD. Do you see that? Do you hear about this? And then she goes and becomes a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and teaching philosophy. All of this tends to be overlooked when we're talking about who Angela Davis is. And so let's go back in time and listen to what she has to say about what it means to engage in revolution.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? Do you get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman. And I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Cariol? We heard about the bombing, and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
So when we talked earlier, you shared that you had a recent conversation with Dr. Davis, and you wanted to say a bit more about what she's thinking these days.
I had a chance to see her and in conversation with Mark Lamont and Dina Khalidi, and then afterwards, I sit on the board that put that event on, so I had a chance to exchange some words with her. But I was struck. This was a few weeks ago, and first of all, I think a couple, I think, addendums to some of the things you said, I think are worth really spending a moment on the ways in which, especially in this week, and irrespective of our nuanced political positions, I think so many of us are feeling the direct impact of what it means to be fully dehumanized in this moment. Not to be seen as fully capable of coherent thought. Like you just said, someone like Angela Davis gets reduced to, quote unquote, a radical that doesn't have all of this. I mean, anyone who could listen to her then or now can hear the brilliance of a woman who has studied, has thought deeply about philosophy, about the world, about this country. And among the things that she points out so brilliantly then and now is that at the heart of this revolutionary thrust, this desire to want change, is not the ridiculousness of being posed with the irony of those who have inflicted some of the most pernicious, destructive forms of violence known to man, then asking those that have been the inheritors of the violence, those dispossessed by the violence, those directly impacted by the violence. Again, she's trying to make clear in the text, it's not theoretical. She would come out of her house and, Klansmen were still out in the open. There were rallies these are people that continued very publicly without any shame or without any form of inhibition, refer to human beings as, less than just completely subhuman, not worthy of any form of respect or sense of dignity. So the fact that she would have to confront that is something that I think we all need to continue to think through. The other thing that I think she spoke to, which was, and she ended her note on, which I found also, so resonant with the work that I do every day and the organizing work, which is about, something that you don't expect, quote unquote, from an Angela Davis is, because of, you think about dialectical materialism. She was speaking, in fact, about the spiritual, cultural, radical imagination. and how critical that was to sustain movements, to constantly, and that our people have had to rely on that tradition ancestrally to be able to imagine a better world, to be able to radically reimagine new possibilities of what it meant to be human beings that are connecting to souls in a different way, right? And I think that resonated really profoundly with me as someone who is deeply, committed to the arts, committed, and I think so much of the same impulse, I think, for our spiritual desires to center spirituality in our movements, and certainly for me is the same impulse to center creative expression, both of which I think without which we are dead. There is no hope. And why I think in a moment like this, fighting hopelessness and fighting despair is part of a spiritual imperative. In fact, in our tradition, in the Muslim tradition, the very word despair is connected to the idea of Satan. In fact, it's the same translation. Belesa means to cause despair. Iblis is the Arabic word for sometimes Lucifer. So in the idea that the diabolical force that is used to subjugate the human soul is often despair, to give up on compassion, mercy, righteousness, justice in the world, and to then resort to the lowest, to be then either acquiescent to the pernicious forces of the world or to join in with those pernicious forces. And I think it's hard not to see the threads of that in our current reality and why it's so critical to invoke the spirit of Angela Davis as not just a radical, revolutionary that gets dismissed, but as that spirit of that spiritual force of liberation that I think connects all of us. And that's what I felt in the room with her the last time she spoke in Chicago a few weeks ago.
And thank you for the reframing of despair, because I've described this as a despairing moment in the nation, and even talked about my own feelings of despair right now. So thanks for bringing a reframe to that, because I certainly don't want to hold on to that. It must be the batteries. Can you bring the screen back up, please? And then go to the next slide. Yes. And so there is this quote from the book, because she spends a lot of time talking about intersectionality and what that means as the Black feminist, and the importance of Black feminism for engaging the issues that we are facing in the world today. And we're still faced with the challenge of understanding the complex ways race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and ability are intertwined, but also how we move, beyond these categories to understand the interrelationships of ideas and processes that seem to be separate and unrelated. They seem to be separate and unrelated, insisting on the connections between struggles and racism in the US and struggles against the Israeli repression of Palestinians. In this sense, is a feminist process. And so I'd like for us to spend a few moments talking about intersectionality, because what she also goes on to say is intersectionality is not simply about the analytics. It's not simply about an analytical understanding, an intellectual approach. It is about a lived experience. And that's where you started, talking about this lived experience that has these threads that are running through different communities that had an influence on your experience. And this whole book is talking about the necessity of seeing life and the struggle through an intersectional lens.
Yeah, you know, earlier before we were talking about some of these powerful ways that sitting with one another, connecting to one another, why some of the most difficult organizing work I've done in the last 30 years has been that multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith community organizing, building alliances and coalitions, but it is the absolute essential and only way I think we move forward. And there's no replacement to then understanding the access. And for me, it was absolutely critical in my formation. And I'm an absolute beneficiary of the privilege of being able to sit in those spaces. I was drawn to, you know, I'm not a trained theologian. My discipline is sociology. And I think, and again, I did not gravitate to sociology from the academy. I gravitated to sociology because I did have, I think, a deep spiritual, sociological inquiry. I wanted to understand the circumstances, and I wanted to better understand how I relate to those and how people came about to their struggles. And sitting with people also helped to inform me in very, very deep ways, and inform the way I think about the world and the way I think about ancestral connections. I mean, I will go to sit with a First Nation elder that I'll call my sheikha, you know, who is a woman, a First Nation leader, who's a Muslim woman, an African American woman, who's as steeped in Black liberation traditions as she is in the church, as she is in Islam, as she is in her First Nation identity. And she would never even use the word intersectional. She would never even deploy that. But she is the living embodiment of it, right? When I'm sitting with her and she can break into church hymns and then sing Islamic creed, you know, La ilaha illallah, you know, nasheeds that go back, if you will, devotional traditions that go back 1,400 years, and then talk about her own Choctaw traditions in relationship struggles. This is a Black woman who has also lived her own experiences, have been able to understand the intrinsic reality of intersectionality as a lived experience. And when you understand that and see that and connect that and say, oh yeah, this feels right, this feels liberatory. And I believe it's a deep spiritual journey to get there. And you begin to understand why these movements have to be infused with that kind of tradition, because this is not, as she emphasizes in this book, time and time again in many of her speeches, and why this kind of freedom, this constant struggle, why she goes back to the radical reconstruction age, why we talk about and why it's so important to understand the lineage of those journeys, why it's important to listen to my grandfather and talk about, you know, what they were undergoing during that 1948 moment, what Jerusalem felt like in 1925, to understand that Jewish, Christian, Muslim people existed with one another in a very different context, that weren't are defined by settler colonial projects in the way they are now, that those structures, you know, don't define. We have to go back to journeys to get to that moment. That has now words that sometimes scare people because they sound like you can only get access to them in a graduate school workshop. But I think we have to bring them, I think they're grounded and they're rooted in people like Grandmother Walks on Water. And I want to say her name. I call her my sheikha, but she goes by Grandmother Walks on Water, who is, again, probably couldn't tell you what intersectionality was but again, lives it and speaks to it by her essence, because and is spiritually brings life to people through who she is as a human being, and sits on the tradition of her own mother, and the fact that these are ancestral traditions. And I do think that what Dr. Davis is getting at in this particular moment, the connection between Palestinian liberation and why this last year has been so critical in creating such consciousness among courageous, beautiful, and often young souls across this country, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, those of various different political even persuasions, that have found ways to better reorient the way in which we connect to the history of this struggle, and then the current reality of the genocidal, violence that is being waged upon the Palestinian people in this moment, and understanding our own interconnected struggles to this. For me, even in the face of all of this darkness, has been a moment of light, has been a moment of hope, has been a moment, illuminated moment. And even amid the pain, because the most, I think, gripping, eviscerating pain that any Palestinian has experienced in the last year is the feeling of complete and utter dehumanization. I referred to it before, because there's no way to rationalize. And at one point, maybe 6-7 months ago, you would see the Israeli officials try to provide an official explanation for why we had to bomb the hospital, the ICU unit, why we had to kill the 25 doctors, the EMT workers, the social workers, why we had. At this point, there's even no explanation. In the last few days, dozens of people, again, have been brutally murdered and slaughtered in hospital wards and units and tents. The only way to process that at some point, whether we explicitly say it or not, is those people are no longer worthy of full, complete human value. You can't see the images of mothers having to go collect their children, literally, in pieces, not unlike the way Dr. Davis talked about limbs strewn out in front of churches, mothers having to go, and we know of 40,000 plus that have been killed, but that doesn't speak to the tens of thousands. We haven't done anything close to a forensic analysis of what this genocidal violence has led to. And I think when all of the dust settles and the light of day are shine, the voices of clarity, the voices of consciousness, and the conscience of our spiritual convictions and all of our traditions, when we look back on this last year, first and foremost, I believe are going to be the voices of the young people across this country who connected in some very real ways to those ancestral traditions, to say that that's not right. It's not human. I was at an encampment in university at DePaul, one of my undergraduate alma maters, and they were there for 25 days, a Catholic university. And at the end, they finally called in the CPD to close down the encampment. And it was a young African-American 19-year-old who was trying, you can tell, young woman who looked disheveled. She'd been out there for a long period of time, who was on the microphone trying to give hope to the rest of the students and the folks that were gathered there, that the struggle will continue. I was just so inspired by her. I was so animated by the light on this beautiful young woman's face. And I had to pull her aside, and I just had to ask, who are you? And why are you doing what you've done? Turns out she had literally slept every single night of that encampment on that lawn. She was a first-generation college student from LA area in Chicago that at the time of her exams had to confront those images and said, I can no longer sit in a classroom knowing that my entire cohort of colleagues in Gaza are either killed or displaced. It was that kind of act of just human empathy and connectivity and solidarity that goes beyond the idea of just what a impersonal solidarity looks like, or an impersonal kind of way of connecting with each other's struggles. And it was a real lived, if you will, kind of and embodied sense of those people are me and I am them. And as that quote, this inescapable network of mutuality, right? This idea of being tied in a single garment, that aspirational vision that King spoke of when he talked about our common humanity, that ultimately our liberation is tied into one another at this deep spiritual, if you will, level. I think it's voices like that young woman who, in my mind, invoke that legacy of what Dr. Angela Davis is speaking about in this text, that a lived intersectionality, that understand that at almost a deep ancestral level, that has given me such hope in moments of, yes, extraordinary possibilities of despair this last year.
Yes, yes. Because you're also speaking to something that has been on my mind for the last year. When the protests began to happen, when the encampments began to spring up, there was a surprise across America that African Americans were being aligned with Palestine and being pro-Palestinian. They were surprised, which is another reason I grabbed the book, Ferguson, Palestine. And what you've just articulated, what you've pointed out from Dr. Davis, is there should be no surprise, given the experiences when we're looking historically of African Americans, even that journey, which she talks about in the book, the journey to becoming African American was a fraught journey. And so she's saying that we need to see that our journey is resonant with the journeys of others.
Yeah, absolutely, including, and that's why this attempt to position and you know, religious traditions against one another in this discourse, are to position communities against one another, is such a disingenuous way of really confronting something that is much more straightforward. I've said, you know, we can sit with the nuanced complexities of things as long as we don't duck and dodge the very uncomplicated truths. Look, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I also had the privilege of being in conversation with recently, who on his book tour in Chicago, was gracious enough to ask me to be his interlocutor with him at a humanities festival after writing The Message.
Mm-hmm.
And again, another, I think, must-read text for our moment. And with James Baldwin-esque clarity, speaks very, very straightforwardly about his trip. And this is bothering a profound number of people across this country. And he's saying very simply, I didn't attempt to be the authority on a 150-year history of, or even longer than that, on Israeli-Palestinian politics and dynamics. I, number one, wrote to my students, and I spoke unapologetically as a man with a particular type of ancestry who experienced certain things, and just wrote directly to my experience. Either apartheid is wrong or it isn't. And that was as simple as it was for him. There was a simple clarity. And that clarity is, again, about a lived experience. It's about being able to identify with pain and suffering. It's about what Brian Stevenson talks about proximity, being proximate to those in pain. And certainly that tradition has also included being absolutely proximate to the legacy and the pernicious anti-Semitic tropes that animated so much of the pain and suffering that drove Jewish communities from pogroms into places like historic Palestine and to this country, and not in any way, shape, or form ever abandoning the commitment to seeing Jewish communities being able to live and thrive in full, absolute freedom, and being able to still maintain that position and speak to the humanity of Palestinian suffering, and not having to, again, have that type of position. I think there's some type of a linguistic complexity that gets used when you have to describe that as a pro-Palestinian position, as opposed to just, isn't this what it means to be a human being? To reclaim kind of a sense of being able to identify with human suffering wherever that is, and particularly when those who claim to speak on our behalf with our resources, with our funds, with our legal protection, are causing such extraordinary harm. And I think that is the type of clarity that a Dr. Angela Davis, I think, invites us to think about. And perhaps this year, even amid, there is complexity, but I do think students did challenge us across this last year to think about things like divestment and disclosing. That's just good democratic practices. You know, where do we aspire to live the values that animate so many of our great traditions throughout the ways in which we live in the world, including in our institutions, in our endowments? And I think that challenge and that demand was a powerful one.
Mhm.
It confronted us, to all of us, to think through that. And I think I went to each encampment in the University of Chicago, from the University of Chicago Northwestern in Chicago and in New York, and spent some time with Jewish students, Muslim students, Christian students on those encampments. I spent some time in deep conversation about anti-Semitic tropes and how there was a commitment to shut that down anywhere it would ever appear its head by any outside agitator that was trying to then, conflate those very ugly, pernicious tropes with the core of what was a movement, I think, calling for a really basic human right of disconnecting and disassociating ourselves with genocidal violence.
I want to transition us to have conversation with those who are online as well as those who are in the room. But you've also said something that I think is important for us to lift up, that there is this attempt to make sure we remain separate. That Dr. Davis is talking about the movements, but if we see these movements in isolation, they never really take on the effectiveness that they could have.
Yeah.
And so she's encouraging us to be organized in our movements so that it becomes not just a moment, but an actual movement. And so I want to try and move us along.
Yeah.
One of the things that Iliff is dedicated to is engaging in the histories of the local context, which we have here in Iliff, the history of what is identified as the book, which was this book of Christian history written in Latin with the cover that was made of a murdered Lenape Indian man. His skin was flayed and created this book cover. We have this history of the Sand Creek Massacre here in Colorado that Iliff is related to. And so we are very intentional about engaging in the histories of First Nation, Native American and some will say, no, not Native American, Indians. So of being intentional about building relationship and helping to restore our mutual humanity. There is the history you named, Dr. Vincent Harding, of the liberation movement that was African American, but he also was reaching across to be interreligious and have this spiritual movement. And so for this transition, screen please, I want to point to a colleague named Dr. Danielle Seawalker, who is a Lakota woman who is an artist. And she developed this piece. This artwork is called G is for Genocide. It's about, this is quoting her, it's about me expressing the idea of parallels between what is happening to the innocent people in Gaza to that of the genocide of Native American populations here in our land. The beauty of art is that it's all about expression. In my opinion, good art makes you uncomfortable. It makes you question perspectives. And so she was invited to be an artist in resident within one of our communities. And when they saw this particular piece of art, she was uninvited. And so I just wanted to point to this piece of art to say how she is identifying that we must see our struggles, Angela Davis's, intersectionally. And so I am noting that Iliff is attempting to do this as we open up this conversation for everyone to engage Rami in what we've talked about tonight, what is the content of the book, and how we need to move forward. So there are mics on both sides of the room. Please go to a mic and ask your question. If there are questions online, please present those while folks are lining up to ask questions.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to connect what we're talking about to some of the conversations that happened during the last teach-in session about investment and divestments. In chapter 3 of this book, Angela Davis talks about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement at UCLA and how that was a part of a larger divestment and boycott movement that was taken up by a number of different academic organizations. At our last teach-in, the perspective presented by the board was that on the one hand, we're not able to say whether human rights violations or genocide are happening in Gaza, so that is complicated. And on the other hand, that if we just stop investing in things we don't like, soon there's nothing else left to invest in. I am wanting to ask, how would Dr. Angela Davis respond to this logic?
Mhm. Well, I will make a opening. I'm not a Davis scholar, excuse me. But what she does advocate is that we really need to challenge capitalism and the ways that capitalism has continuously encouraged dehumanization through what she is emphasizing, some of out of her own experience, the prison industrial complex, which she also connects to lots of history of suffering in America, of dehumanization, and definitely connects it with racism. And so she is, I think, very clear to say that we must look at, not just look at, we must change the ways we are using the capitalist system that continues to support dehumanization. And we must move away from that. And sometimes that does, in fact, mean divesting, but more importantly, it means that we prioritize human life over a capitalist system that, and here's where I'm stepping into my own knowledge of and commitments, a capitalist system that was developed at the very moment we began to develop systems that would encourage and support dehumanization.
I mean, yeah, I think, again, I'm not aware of the nuances here of those conversations at the board, but I'll say a couple of things about that more generally, where I think Dr. Davis is at, and what I think her position is a little more, in my sense, straightforward about BDS and divestment as the most viable, if you will, peaceful means of protest that has emerged over the last, a number of years to try to agitate and challenge institutions across not only the country, but really across the globe on investments, and to challenge institutions that have aspirational ideals that they try to lift up in their doctrines and their charters. For me at DePaul, it was the Vincentian Catholic ideals. I think all of our traditions have these great, again, aspirational type of creeds and proclamations and decrees that kind of call to the oneness of humanity, the call to social justice, and the gap between those ideals and lived realities, and the abilities to confront those gaps, I think is where the real beauty comes out of. I mean, I think there's beauty in actually confronting those things. I think there's spiritual richness that comes out in the type of conversations you talked about, when we can confront how we're all implicated, that sometimes our hands, this is not to evade accountability at a greater level, but in some ways, all of us who live in these systems are beneficiaries of them. All of us are complicit in different ways, and we shouldn't try to run and evade that, but also come to terms with it in some very real ways. I think two things come to mind when I think about when you were speaking very directly about BDS here, and more broadly. I think the ideas. I know when we were at Chicago Theological Seminary, those larger conversations, the United Church of Christ made commitments that there were ways to identify. There were ways to identify assets that were toxic assets that we are invested in. There were ways to still sit with complicated nuance and find direct ways to divest. And I think Angela Davis would probably go a little further to even suggest, like you were saying, that the dehumanization and capital, and when we start understanding capitalism, is not, again, it shouldn't be understood at just a high theoretical Marxist level, but to bring it back down to grassroots human understanding. When you go and see, for instance, Montgomery, and you walk around Montgomery and what Brian Stevenson has done there, and understand the legacy of what enslaved human beings and their connection to capital securities, and how that undergirded the formation of the modern economic system, that then idea of dehumanization and assigning human beings to a capital value that undergirds the wealth that we are still living with today in America, it becomes much more granular. So I do think that the invitation by Dr. Davis is the invitation to confront this, to challenge it. Yeah.
And one other comment there, I recently received a petition that is circulating among the United Methodist Church that's calling for Methodist clergy, Methodist lay folks to insist that Westpath divest from Israel, Morocco, and there was a third, but there is still a movement afoot within United Methodism to have that happen.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Malcolm Newton, the nephew of Huey P. Newton. And I want to say we salute you, brother. Thank you for being here. My question is around the question that the prophet Vincent Harding always talked about. Is America possible? Because we're living in, we talk about these challenging times like it's different. It's nothing different about these times. This is the America that we are born and raised and live in. Trump represents that system. This is where we live. This is how we're able to dialogue and connect and have critical exchange intellectually and what have you. I thank God for a man like you who on the ground. My question concerns something that I think you overlooked, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to challenge both of you. And that is, Angela Davis said, a good friend of mine as well, insisting on the connections between struggles and racism in the US and the struggles against the Israeli repression of Palestine, in this sense, is a feminist process. I hadn't heard any of you comment on that. Why would she say, in this sense, is a feminist process? Why don't you say, in this sense, this is a spiritual process? Or sociological process, or interconnection process. But she said this, in this sense, it's a feminist process.
And that's where it's important to have context, because in the book, she's being asked questions for which she is then answering. And so the question was really about what is and how do you define Black feminism? And so that's where she goes down into, and in this sense, is really answering the question about Black feminism. But I was wanting to emphasize how she began and what she was emphasizing throughout the book of the intersectionality that we cannot separate our human experiences in order to attack a given problem. That if one is going to be free, all of us must be free. We have to have that, which I've been emphasizing here in Iliff. We have to have the approach of the Black Women's Club movement, that we lift as we climb, that we are all in this together and we are only going to get out by being together. And so that's one of the reasons I was so excited that Rami even accepted this invitation, because I know he works in community across what we would identify as difference, but he's not naming it difference. He's naming it as, this is who we are together, and this is what we must do together. And so I was reflecting back on even our coming together at Chicago and the work that we were attempting to do together, and how he was inspiring me and encouraging me that some of what I was beginning to look at that time, it's not very far apart, but since I've moved into administration, I'm a little distant from it. But, you know, looking at Ishmael and his relationship with Ibrahim, and how to understand that relationship and connect it to what the experiences of African-American men, and to talk about that. And he said to me, I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about that. Well, I'm still trying to say it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, no, but I still want to hear that. I can't, I still love to hear that analysis. First of all, such an honor to be in your presence, my brother, and the legacy that you represent undoubtedly one that has had a profound influence on me. And in Chicago, we have the opportunity to, Fred Hampton and his son has been a big part of our circles, and had a chance during COVID with Fred Hampton Jr. to actually, it was a very surreal experience because we sat, that was a time where you can actually book theaters for $125 because no one was going to theaters. And Judas and the Black Messiah, with all its problems from a Hollywood standpoint, still was a film that Fred was helping to consult on. So we watched it together with him, and it was just a surreal moment, but it was a living moment. That these histories, I was sitting in front of the brother watching that moment at that, that horrific murder of his father while being in the belly of his mother at that time, and seeing both the legacy and the history of both trauma and freedom, right? That we carry these lines. And so it's an honor to be here with you. And I think you put on, going back to this insistence that Dr. Davis mentions in that particular sentence, I do think it's interesting. I think we should stop for a moment and think about the role Black feminists and Black women specifically in framing feminism have had in thinking about the connections between our struggles, because I think quite arguably, as even demonstrated this week and consistently, there's no one who's paid more of a price of that work and that sacrifice and that struggle than Black women. And especially on issues when it comes to connecting those dots. And I think the insistence is Black feminism, as I understand it, I'm certainly not a scholar of it, but as I understand it, articulated in moments by Dr. Davis and others, is about a recovery of humanity. If you will, the misogyny and the patriarchy that has attempted to dehumanize women as less than fully human beings, the systems that the freedom struggle that is necessary to recover humanity from that is absolutely linked to the struggles to recover humanity from Palestinians, right? In the same kind of way. And so the connections there for her were just, again, very natural and organic. And I do think it's worth stating that in a moment like this, whether it's, from esteemed positions of presidents of, major universities like Harvard, are the day-to-day women in movements, are young women on campuses, are artists, or, a number of women in person, those who have had to pay the price for speaking out, for making those connections. Invariably, I have even seen in this last year, the number of folks. And if you talk about public figures from Chisholm to Cynthia McKinney, to what we saw with Cori Bush, to what we've seen with Angela Davis, to the silencing of Michelle Alexander, who was a celebrated public intellectual until she wrote an editorial in the New York Times on MLK Day a few years ago, right? And made the connection and said, I've been silent on this issue for way too long. It has been the persistent voice of Black women who, I think, tapping into a womanist feminist tradition of making those connections even at the cost of their own well-being, time and time again, that has given us, I think, so much to be able to not only acknowledge as absolutely critical to our movements, but actually indispensable to our own humanity. So thank you for raising it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because she also goes on to say that it is necessary for us to engage the struggle appropriately. It's necessary that feminism not simply be the work of women, but men must also engage in feminism. And while I have not been engaging in Black feminism, I am very committed and formed by, my intellectual life has been deeply formed by womanist. And so some of my leading mentors are womanist scholars, both theologians and ethicists. And So I could say more about that, but we have someone at the mic.
No, no,
No, go right ahead, please.
that wasn't my intention. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. My name is Linda, and I'm a Palestinian American who was born in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, steps away from Masjid al-Aqsa, and raised in a village near Ramallah, and grew up during the Intifada for most of the first Intifada, and has lived under the occupation for many years. I have a couple of things I would like to see you guys touch on, and I appreciate your being in community with you tonight and your presence here with us, Dr. Rami. One of the things is the trauma aspect. As a Palestinian, I've come to realize there is no PTSD because the trauma is ongoing, and there isn't really a way to process it very easily. And because I choose to wake up every day and do the work, because of the urgency of the matter, I have found that it's really difficult to balance the ability to grieve and to face that trauma head on. And I see that with all our brothers and sisters who, we are working together on different issues, not just the Palestinian issue, but also our unhoused and our migrant community that I've had the privilege to work with in this last year and continue to do so. We go to City Council every Monday in Denver, but before that, I'm at Mutual Aid Monday. And that's a huge part of, I have dubbed it the Corner of Joy. I would invite you guys to come and check it out. It's every Monday from 4 to 7 in front of the city and county building. And that's the irony. It's right in front of City Council. And then we go up to talk about the Palestinian issue and talk about all the issues that we are facing locally. And so I wonder how you can address that piece, like the work you've been doing for all these years in the community, within the community. How do you balance that trauma aspect, whether it's what you're facing yourself or what you're facing in community, and leaning on one another to keep doing the work. The other piece is just also a very important aspect in organizing and working within the community. Obviously, it's been over a year specifically with this issue, and people have grown exhausted, and understandably so. And I'm just wondering, with the type of work that we have to do, we have so much work before us. And I wish I would have brought my phone to do the quote, but Dr. John Lewis, or Reverend John Lewis, the late Reverend John Lewis, has a beautiful quote regarding that like, this is not just related to one presidential term or just, what we're going through now. This is something that will continue for many lifetimes, and we each have to do our part in our generation. And so I'm wondering, how have you used your work, or how have you been able to do the work? Because inevitably there are going to be disagreements, people that will taper off, people that will view how to go about in this movement in a different way. How do we continue to do the work? And obviously it's going to be even harder now. How do we continue to do that, knowing that these things do exist within the movement, and how do we overcome them?
Those are very layered and important questions. So thank you for asking them. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge you and Jazakallah khair for, for everything. As a Jerusalemite, Jerusalem is a very sacred place for me, and the Beled Adima, the old city. I think sometimes people don't really appreciate our ancestral connection to this sacred space. Goes way before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. That we see our spiritual connection as wedded to the same traditions that others hold in their books. We talk about the stories of Suleiman, Solomon. My grandfather is named after Dawood, David. So these colonial appropriations of religious texts to justify settler violence is such a it's absolutely akin to everything that we saw in this nation with eugenicist movements and manifest destiny as a way to justify extermination of Native Indians and Native traditions and communities. So when and it speaks to your first point, which is, I have to be real with you. It's like, I'm a community organizer. I lead a community nonprofit institution that's a federally qualified health center. We have over 120 full-time people in Atlanta and Chicago. My days, and then I try to do academy stuff and artist stuff on the side. So I'm absolutely full every single day. And there are moments, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name again. Linda. Linda, as you probably know, there are moments, even as you ask that question, that hit me as a reminder. And I think I've had those moments where, and I'm feeling a little bit of it now, where like in the presence of another Palestinian, where the trauma is real. And the fact that I haven't processed it is real, you know? And so I don't have a good answer for you about that. I don't quite know how to deal with it. I do know that part of the medicine and therapy is in the work, and perhaps why do the work, why run to the work, like you talked about, why I run to the sacred spaces. I had a feeling reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book this year saying that, and I shared it with him, it is the most seen I have felt in the entire year. As a Palestinian. And it's the simple stuff that I think it's not just the horror of our experiences last year that I think people don't see. It's the beauty of who we are as a people. It's the beauty of this ancestral people. It's the children that sing, that feed each other. It's the humanity of the Palestinians that I think gets so lost. And for those of us who have a direct connection to that, and having to endure what we are seeing is very difficult. And so while I don't have the answer, I do know that a lot of it lies in our ability to be human beings with one another. And I do believe that the spiritual traditions that are part of our people's ancestral connection to that land is where the healing comes from, and why, we have a tradition. Why in the most, my family from Jerusalem, when I go back to Jerusalem, I never want to leave the old city of Jerusalem. I don't even like going anywhere outside that old city, because there's such a connection to that space that I think is hard to explain to people unless you're there and you feel it. When I'm on the sacred compound, even within that geography, there's a place by the rock, the Sakhra, the mosque, that I just never want to leave. And part of it is we believe in the Muslim tradition that when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings, part of what makes that a sacred tradition in the Muslim context is that the Prophet Muhammad, in his 23-year life as a prophet, has this moment in one of the most difficult moments of his life. It's called Sanat al-Huzn, the year of sadness, that he goes on this miraculous night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem on this miraculous winged creature, and then up into the seven heavens. And he encounters the divine in this journey that later becomes, by the way, the fodder for Dante's Inferno and in his work, in which talk about European legacy of Muslim Islamic phobia stuff, turns that very source material on the Muslims to feed this Western European kind of hatred of Muslim and Islamic traditions. But the Prophet Muhammad, before he ascends into the heavens, it's reported that he gathers with over 225,000 prophets, messengers, teachers of every tradition sent to every people on the face of the planet, and they pray together. And there's something about the beauty of that tradition for me that when I'm there, I feel like there's a reason why that if I believe that if you're in touch with any of your spiritual ancestry, wherever it comes from, you'll feel yourself there on that rock. And so I share that with you, Linda, to say that for me, thinking about those places give me solace. And like you said in, you know, the citation of the righteous trouble of our great quote, the movement, my only answer in this moment, again, is to go back what I shared in the beginning, which I am fully aware when I sit at the feet of people like Grandmother Walks on Water, of the intergenerational long journey this is going to take. And I'm a community organizer. I'm a trained community organizer. And I believe one of the courses I taught at CTS was community organizing as a spiritual tradition. I believe in the power of community organizing, whether it came out of the radical tradition of our, you know, the Panthers and this brother's, you know, family and the legacy, or whether it came out of the great tradition of Saul Alinsky and the rabbinical traditions within which he was raised. I believe there's a spiritual insight to community organizing, which puts us in community with one another, that thinks about the power of our expanded self-interest, a term that is often misunderstood in religious circles to be selfishness. When Alinsky, I think, was talking about how do we create a more communal sense of stakes that we could all begin to see we have a stake in each other's liberation. And one of the things I find liberatory about that idea is creating smaller wins. Right? Community organizing believes in this idea of along a journey to make sure we celebrate small wins, to make sure that we create moments of joy. Palestinian kids, I think the moments that break me down about the footage is to still see amid the carnage, the unspeakable, unimaginable carnage of kids that are still gathering in corners of Gaza with a tabla and a guitar and dancing and singing. And this idea of spiritual, communal, artistic joy and celebration, to be able to celebrate even small moments of what it means that this is resistance, that these small victories of us coming together, that's the only way I can envision a pathway forward to a greater future. And I have to think that those who endured what they endured on this continent, those that we sit on their shoulders, the ancestors of enslaved people, of what they had to endure for us to be able to be here, to even read the words of Angela Davis, you know, and to come from what she came from. She had to list and sit on the shoulders of ancestors that believed in a trajectory that would last 150 to 200 years. And I think now more than ever, we need to be able to continue to tap into that.
One final word that is a theoretical, because you began by saying post-traumatic, and it's not post-traumatic that you are experiencing, and recognizing that some years ago, I developed a term which I only spoke about in one book in a very short section, that is not post-traumatic stress that we're experiencing. It really is protracted traumatic stress, because it's not one moment that is post-traumatic that we have to get beyond. And the society in which we live has this approach to pain that says, just get over it, because it was once and done, it's in your past. And I'm saying, no, there is a protracted trauma that we are carrying in our bodies that has been passed along from generation to generation, but we can also draw upon the same strength of the generations that help us to overcome, which is where you were actually speaking.
Yeah, I love that, by the way. Where is that? In what text is that?
My first book, A Loving Home.
Okay, I have to get that. And it reminds me, one of our exhibits this last year was called DNA Joy.
Mm.
And it took that same principle from artist, one First Nation artist and another, Latina artist, who were drawing off that if the same idea of this protracted stress, that we carry the trauma, but that we also have the access to ancestral joy, ancestral light. And how do we learn to access that even as we confront the realities of this protracted stress? I think that's a brilliant intervention. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for journeying to Denver at such a weather moment as this. Our time has come to a close. Oh, okay. Yes, go right ahead.
There's no time. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Salam, Shenebru Shalom. So peace. And that's why Muslim greet each other when they see each other. Instead of hello, we say Salam alaikum. My name is Muhammad Abdel Salam. Muhammad, the servant of the peace. And the peace, that's my last name, one of the attributes of God. I was thinking all this time about everything that was said, and I was trying to formulate a question for you regarding a lot of things that all the movement, the protest against what's happening in the Middle East and Gaza, boycott, divestment, investment, all of that. And then I remember a verse from the Holy Book, the Quran. The Quran is our holy book, the Muslim holy book. We pray with the Quran every day. We practice reading it and memorize it. So this one verse from chapter number 22, Surah Al-Hajj, and that verse is number 40. And then I'm going to come to the questions. I'm just going to read it in Arabic and then English. It's a short one. الذين أخرجوا من ديارهم بغير حق إلا أن يقولوا ربنا الله ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض لهدمت صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا ولا ينصرن الله من ينصره إن الله لقوي عزيز. Closest meaning in English. Those who have been evicted from their homes without right, only because they say our Lord is Allah. And were it not that Allah checks the people, some by means of others, and people are pushing each other to stop the bad things. That's what in Arabic, but the English sometimes is not really clear. There would be, if people don't do that, there would be means of others. Would be means of others. There would have been demolished. So if people don't do that, then push each other to stop the bad things, what is going to happen is churches will be demolished, monasteries, synagogues, and mosques, in which the name of Allah is much mentioned. And Allah is an Arabic word for God. And Allah will surely support those who support Him. Indeed, Allah is powerful and exalted in might. We've seen every single church and mosque and places of worship in Gaza were destroyed. I think that was the first thing that was done. So my question is, why is that? And why is Allah, God, saying that there is always people going to push each other to stop the bad thing? I know this is happening. A lot of people, even Jews, are against what's happening. We have Jews against occupation movement. We have Jewish a voice for peace are against what's happening and against Israeli, what they do. So we're having all that's happening. But again, the question is, why the world is allowing that to happen? While Allah, 1400 years ago, taught Muhammad, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad, and the companion, that this is what's going to be stopped by others. So the question is there anything mentioned in Dr. Davis' book in that regard of the destruction of the places of worship? And why is that like was very important for Israeli soldier to destroy? Oh, you know, we Muslim who believe who pray anywhere that's clean. We don't have to have a building. If we have a building that's, so people in Gaza right now are praying outside in the rubbles. They pray Salat al-Eid, they pray, Dr. Rami. So since you're Muslim and all that, so maybe can you put all of it into a context of the current time that's happening and the world feeling like it's deserting Gaza and a genocide, United States, and we heard politicians, journalists, professors saying that the war in Gaza is not done by Israel. It is by United States. And we live in here. So just if you can clarify that to us and to ever, having this misunderstanding. Thank you.
About time, do you want to take try to consolidate a shorter? I'll try to speak to that. Yeah.
Hi, I appreciate that. I should have stood up sooner. I got nervous and inspired by everyone here. I come from I'm hoping to study physics. And I come towards everything from a kind of limiting perspective of concrete evidence and observation and data and numbers, which is limiting for the purpose of dehumanized truth. We're not dealing with doctor research is different and real life has to get real. Physics is real, but anyways, one thing that really disappoints me, and I noticed this with the encampments, I always felt, and so I thought your question was beautiful because you mentioned how you're trying to divest from Israel's genocide. This is the only place I feel comfortable to say that out loud. If you want to divest from Israel's genocide, you have to divest entirely out of the economy, which I guess it's not possible if it's a business. And these are complicated concepts because the powerful people, they have to manipulate us, or I don't want to speak on too much on that, but I feel grateful that right now there's a lot of objective evidence, scientific observation and truth on all of our suffering, not just the horrifying extremes in Palestine right now. I'm Ethiopian American, not just the horrifying extremes with the Tigray people. My family's Amara. It's dangerous for Amara people who are suffering a genocide to talk about Tigray's genocide. No one here is Amara, so that's why I feel brave to say that. And the logic and the politics and the media and logical fallacies is really hard to argue against. And they have me thinking, maybe the genocide is my fault. That's how good they can talk. Basically, I want to say, is it not possible? Can the academics, can the people collecting this data that clearly shows the price of rising income inequality of housing, abortion is absolutely an issue, but the parent issue of that is maternal mortality rates, numbers of that clear, no matter what your political ideology. Boycotting is such an abstract economic concept. I know the students didn't fully understand it, but they were brave enough to be there. I wasn't. Can the academics who study that, the data, the numbers, can they not do more to unify that data in a language that is clear that the politicians and the leaders cannot divide us with? Police brutality hurt white people and Black. It hurt us proportionately more, but it hurts everyone, et cetera, et cetera. Data is hard to read, but is there not more they can do to bring us all into their world where the suffering is clear? So much so that there's evidence now. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I appreciate both those last questions. And I appreciate everybody that gathered here and those online tonight. And again, Dr. Butler, thank you so much for the invitation. I think the immediate, I wasn't aware. I knew this was going to be the week it was. I don't think I was aware of how much I was in need of being able to get out of Chicago. and to have the opportunity to be in conversation with you and re-engage the text. So thank you. I'll try to speak very succinctly, and I'm willing to stay after for some of those. But let me speak first to the I think you Muhammad, right? Yeah. Alhamdulillah, Muhammad Abdus Salam. Sharafna for Sayyida. Yeah. Iyakum, inshallah. So speak to this. I do think what you're invoking is really powerful, right? Two things, and I'll try to succinctly try to speak to them. One, all of our traditions, whether in the Quran, the Torah, and the Gospels, I think there's religious challenges that talk about tests, that oppression of others, right? That are actually tests for all of humanity. In other words, sometimes when we ask ourselves questions of why there's such profound human suffering that is allowed to happen, to unfold when you believe in an all-powerful divine, that in some ways the response in those religious texts is that is a test for those of us who still claim to be adhering to morals of principles and consciousness across the entire planet. What are we doing when all they are saying is we just want to be among those that are worshiping God in peace, right? And as you mentioned, and I must say, I was among the only Palestinians that was brought into the Roosevelt room in the early stages of this genocidal war to try to rationalize with President Biden. And I had to confront him directly in a small meeting that got some news. And, I was very ambivalent about whether I was taking this meeting. I eventually did. And I was among 5 people, the only Palestinian at that moment. I think there was another Palestinian 4 months later who walked out of a meeting who lost hope in the fact that this president was capable of identifying with Palestinian suffering. At the time, the excuse was being used as it was. Even now, as I mentioned, the IDF doesn't even have to cite the reason for why they are obliterating religious sites, hospitals, nursery schools, UN agencies, food depots. You don't hear that anymore. There was a moment early on in this genocidal war where there was more psych ops kind of PR pieces explaining, and at that time, everything was about a command and control center by Hamas. Whether there was substantiated evidence to suggest that there was an underground command and control center. I confronted the president himself saying, Mr. President, yesterday, the Israelis just literally blew up the 4th oldest church in the world in Gaza with families that were huddling in there with absolute no evidence of any command and control center. How do we speak to that? There was no real response from him. And the reality is, you're absolutely right. The desecration of religious sacred spaces has been part of what's mobilized communities, I think, across the globe. First and foremost, brave, courageous people that have been out in the streets, including many Jewish rabbis and many clergy, including in Chicago, a rabbi by the name of Brent Rosen, who along with Israeli rabbis and Jewish rabbis this last Passover went in protest of what was happening to the border of Gaza with food ready to breach the border themselves and risk arrest and violence. So people who are, I think, taking up the imperative in those verses that you cited to say that the call really in this moment is to all of us that speak to any sense of religious tradition to speak out and to speak for humanity, not just Palestinians, but to speak for humanity. The crime of genocide is not against one group of people. Genocide is the crime against humanity. And the evidence that has been marshaled to suggest, to speak to this brother, that there is a genocidal war happening, I think is indisputable, right? And I think history will prove as we garner more and more evidence of what type of damage was and carnage inflicted on Gaza, there will be indisputable evidence to prove that I believe that the Israelis have carried out genocidal violence against Palestinians in Gaza. And I think that will be as clear as day in a few years, and we will look back on this moment and acknowledge it as such. I appreciate the brother who mentioned your Amaro background and was able to also speak openly to the genocidal, I think, violence inflicted upon the Tagaro people. And in Tigray, if we're not familiar with that struggle that has been going on for the last 3 years, that those are important moments, not just to speak out against and for our Tagaro communities and for all of our communities, but to recognize that these are sacred spaces. And I'll end with that. And I appreciate your ability to come here and speak openly to it. We should not, I think, be afraid to talk about genocide, because genocide, whether people want to contest it or not, is a very serious charge that is being brought not frivolously by people like the South Africans or others to international courts. This is a serious conversation that implicates all of us as Americans, and that we will have to reckon with one day. We will have to reckon with. And so I don't think we should run away from this very serious conversation about genocide. And that's why I think among the most courageous voices that have been calling us to those are those that have experienced genocide, including extraordinary artists like the one that you are lifting and celebrating. And I'm grateful for that. First Nation artists, our Jewish American voices that have grown up with the history of genocide and the commitment to never again, and that idea of never again meaning all of us. And so I appreciate you raising that. And I do believe that our sacred traditions call us, that there is good in our sacred traditions that we must reclaim from those that have weaponized some of those traditions to reinforce ideologies that allow genocidal violence against people. I think one thing that has always animated me by a place by Tigray is the history of that place. Not unlike much of the African continent, is often not appreciated. That is one of the oldest sacred places on the planet, where the ancestral traditions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have been practiced in ways that don't look like the ways in which they were practiced in other maybe European contexts, and in ways to recover some of those ancestral practices of those traditions. You can go to Tigray today and see a Jewish, Christian, and Muslim burial, and I guarantee you will have problems for the layperson to identify which one is which. You can even go to Tigray today and find Jewish, Muslim, and Christian prayer practices, and you would find all of them actually prostrating in their practice. So when you see a Muslim prostrating today, for instance, and thinking that that is a idiosyncratic tradition only that Muslims apply, you go to ancient places like Tigray and recover that. Why is that important for the conversation we have tonight? To suggest that we do have ancestral traditions that are interconnected, that are not about these ancient divisions between one another, that there are lots of ways in which we can be invited to see ourselves in one another. And I think when our traditions are working at their best, that's what they're inviting us to do. And in a moment like this, the reclamation of our humanity is the only way forward. And I believe that there are secrets in our traditions that invite, in fact, demand us to do just that.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for being here.
Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. That's from the late Reverend U.S. Representative John Lewis on movement building and Across That Bridge, a vision for change and the future of America. And we all know all his work with the civil rights movement before he became a U.S. representative.